Early June 1945. The rain hammered the mud at Rheinlager See like artillery on soft ground, turning the open field into a brown sea that swallowed boots and dignity alike. 7,000 German prisoners sat in the mire, covered by torn blankets, coughing into the dawn fog. Lieutenant Edward Hartmann stood at the wire perimeter with a clipboard in one hand and orders in the other. Orders that said, minimum containment, minimum rations, no permanent structures. But the medical officer's report listed 35 new cases of pneumonia in 72 hours, and Hartmann knew the mathematics of human collapse. He could build bridges under fire, calculate loads to the ounce, follow material spreadsheets like scripture, but standing there watching men drown in their own camp, he realized the hardest engineering problem wasn't steel or concrete. It was deciding when the rulebook became a death sentence. Hartmann wasn't supposed to care. He'd built his reputation on precision, not compassion. Back in Italy, he'd kept a pontoon bridge operational through 3 days of German shelling by rotating damaged sections every 4 hours, never losing a crossing. He'd requisitioned 17 tons of steel with paperwork so flawless that a quartermaster colonel had framed his supply request as an example of proper military documentation. The men in his battalion called him the calculator because he measured everything twice and trusted nothing but numbers. He was 30 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, where his father ran a machine shop and his mother taught school. He'd studied civil engineering at Case Institute before the war, spent 2 years designing sewage systems for the city, then enlisted when his draft notice arrived in December 1942. The Army discovered he could read blueprints faster than most men could tie their boots, and by Normandy he was building fuel depots and ammunition bunkers across France. He didn't drink with the other officers, didn't gamble, just worked, calculated, requisitioned, and built. But that was before Rheinlager See. The camp sat 3 kilometers outside Bad Kreuznach, in a valley that collected water like a bowl. The Germans had built it in April as a temporary holding facility. Then the Wehrmacht collapsed, and suddenly 7,000 prisoners needed somewhere to exist. The original plan called for 2 weeks maximum occupancy. It was now late May, and the barbed wire perimeter enclosed nothing but open ground, latrine trenches, and desperation. Hartmann's orders came from the 101st Construction Battalion headquarters via courier, typewritten on onion skin paper. Reorganize POW facility Rheinlager See. Ensure containment and minimum sustenance. No permanent construction authorized. Priority remains Allied forces in transit. Translation: keep them alive, barely, and don't waste resources that combat troops might need. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with a jeep, a driver, and a leather satchel full of engineering manuals. The camp commandant, Captain Davies, met him at the gate with a handshake that felt like a formality. Davies was 40, tired, and from New Jersey. He'd been running the camp since April and looked like a man who'd stopped sleeping. "Your problem, Lieutenant," Davies said, walking him toward the wire. "I keep them fed and counted. You keep them from dying of exposure. Medical says we're losing ground." Through the fence, Hartmann saw rows of men sitting on bare earth, hunched beneath canvas tarps strung between stakes. Some wore Wehrmacht gray, others civilian clothes. Many had no boots. A few lay flat in the mud, too sick or too defeated to sit upright. The smell hit him then. Human waste and wet wool and something else. The specific odor of bodies shutting down. How many sick? 112 in the aid station. Another 300 probably should be there, but we don't have the beds. Hartmann watched a prisoner cough into his hand, double over, cough again. The sound carried across the mud like a saw cutting green wood. "What's your mortality rate?" Davies didn't answer immediately. Officially, 0.8% monthly. Unofficially, we had 6 die last week. Pneumonia mostly. 1 from dysentery. Hartman did the math. 6 dead in 7 days meant roughly 1 per day at current trajectory. Over 12 weeks, that was 84 men. Over 6 months, 300. The numbers climbed in his head like a staircase he didn't want to follow. I need to see your depot inventory. They walked to a corrugated shed behind the administrative barracks. Inside, stacked against wooden shelves, sat the remnants of military logistics. 150 GP medium tents, still in their canvas bags. 600 pine boards, salvaged from bombed-out barns. 2 gasoline-powered saws, both functional. Assorted nails, rope, and tarps. Enough material to shelter maybe 800 men if you built efficiently. For 7,000, it was a rounding error. Hartman pulled out his notebook and started sketching. Raised platforms, 30 centimeters off the ground to escape the mud. Canvas shelters over wooden frames. Rotating occupancy so the sickest got priority. He ran the numbers 3 times. Materials needed: 480 boards per structure, 320 nails, 2 gallons of fuel per saw, 110 man-hours of labor. He could build 1 unit. Maybe 2 if he stretched it. But not enough. Never enough. The meeting with the administrative officer happened 2 days later in a requisition farmhouse that still smelled like cabbage and old smoke. Captain Reinhardt, logistics chief for the engineer group, sat behind a desk that didn't belong to him and read Hartman's proposal with the expression of a man being asked to approve a vacation to Berlin. "You want to build beds," Reinhardt said slowly, "for enemy prisoners." "Raise sleeping platforms," Hartman corrected. "Wooden frames with canvas covers. Enough for 1,200 men in rotation. Cost absorbed as training exercise for recruits in carpentry and shelter construction." Reinhardt set the paper down like it might catch fire. "Lieutenant, we have American soldiers sleeping in pup tents while you want to build furniture for Germans." The medical officer reports 35 new pneumonia cases this week. If the mortality rate continues, let me stop you right there. Reinhardt leaned forward. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks ago. These men surrendered. They're not our responsibility beyond basic containment. What you're proposing looks like we're rewarding them. Hartman kept his voice level. "I'm proposing we prevent a health crisis that could spread to our own forces. Pneumonia doesn't check uniforms, Captain. It crosses wire. Then isolate the sick. We don't have isolation facilities. We barely have latrine capacity." Reinhardt rubbed his eyes. "Hartman, I understand you're an engineer and you want to fix things. But this isn't a bridge or a road. These are POWs. The directive from Theater Command is clear. Minimum standard. We feed them, we guard them, we don't build them hotels. I'm not proposing hotels. I'm proposing mud doesn't become a mass grave." The room went quiet. Outside, a truck backfired. Someone shouted in German. Reinhardt picked up the proposal again, skimmed it, then dropped it into a wooden box marked "Denied Requests." "No permanent construction, Lieutenant. Those are your orders. Make do with what you have. Dismissed." Hartman stood, saluted, and left. He didn't argue. Arguing changed nothing with men like Reinhardt, men who operated on policy and political optics. But as he walked back to the jeep, the medical officer's words echoed in his head. 35 cases this week. 12 last week, before that. The progression curve was exponential. In 3 weeks, the camp would be a death trap. He drove back to Rheinlager See and didn't speak to his driver the entire way. That night, sitting in his quarters, a converted stable that still smelled of horses, Hartman opened his notebook and recalculated. If he couldn't get authorization, maybe he could get forgiveness. If he framed it as a test unit, a demonstration of field construction efficiency, Maybe Reinhardt would look the other way. Maybe the bureaucracy would move slowly enough that by the time someone noticed, the structures would already be standing. It was the kind of reasoning that got officers court-martialed. But it was also the kind of reasoning that saved lives when regulations moved slower than disease. Hartman closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling beams. Somewhere in the distance, a prisoner coughed. The sound carried through the wooden walls like a question he couldn't ignore. 3 days after the meeting, the camp medical officer, Lieutenant Samuels, appeared at Hartman's makeshift office with a file folder and an expression that said he'd stopped caring about protocol. Samuels was young, maybe 26, from Baltimore, and had the kind of exhaustion that came from watching preventable deaths. "I'm notifying 35 new respiratory cases for treatment," Samuels said, dropping the folder on Hartman's desk. "That's in addition to the 112 already logged. At this rate, we'll hit 200 by the end of the month." Hartman flipped through the medical reports. Pneumonia, bronchitis, advanced hypothermia, trench foot. Half the diagnoses read like something from a World War I memoir, conditions that shouldn't exist in a supervised facility in June. "What's your recommendation?" "Dry shelter, warm clothes, basic hygiene. Things we don't have and can't requisition because someone in headquarters thinks German soldiers deserve to suffer." Hartman looked up. Samuels wasn't usually this blunt. "You're putting that opinion in writing?" "I already did. Sent a report to Theater Medical Command yesterday. Copied Reinhardt. Highlighted the liability if the Red Cross shows up next month and finds a mortality rate that looks like a medieval siege." That got Hartman's attention. "Red Cross inspection? Scheduled for July. Standard review of POW facilities. If they see what I'm seeing, it's not just a bad report. It's an international incident." Hartman tapped the folder. "Reinhardt denied my shelter proposal 2 days ago." "Then make him undeny it. Show him the numbers. Show him the optics. We're the United States Army, not the SS. We don't let prisoners die from neglect, even if they shot at us 6 weeks ago." Samuels left without waiting for a response. Hartman sat there for 5 minutes, staring at the medical reports, doing the calculus of institutional pressure. The Red Cross visit was leverage, not because headquarters cared about prisoners, but because they cared about looking competent. If inspectors found mass illness, it reflected poorly on the command structure. And if Hartman could pitch his solution as a public relations fix, not a humanitarian gesture, maybe Reinhardt would bite. He grabbed the original proposal, added a new section titled Risk Assessment, International Inspection, and typed up 3 paragraphs about how temporary shelters would demonstrate effective resource management and adherence to Geneva Convention standards during transitional custody phase. Bureaucratic language, ass-covering, the kind of writing that made him feel slightly sick, but sometimes worked. 2 hours later, he was back in Reinhardt's office. This time, the captain actually read the entire document. "You're saying this protects us politically. I'm saying if the Red Cross shows up and sees 200 sick prisoners in open mud, they'll ask why the Army engineers did nothing. This gives you an answer. You authorized a test program for efficient field shelter construction using salvaged materials." Reinhardt set the paper down. "Test program, 1 unit only. If it works, we reassess. If it doesn't, you shut it down and we go back to tents. Understood? And Hartman, you use non-priority materials only. Nothing that combat units might need. Salvage, scrap, local timber. Clear?" "Clear." Reinhardt signed the authorization, a single sentence on the bottom of the proposal. "Approved for limited trial construction pending evaluation." Not enthusiastic, not supportive, just barely permissive. Hartman folded the paper into his jacket pocket and walked out before Reinhardt could change his mind. 48 hours later, the first shelter stood. 20 meters long, 4 meters wide, walls made from salvaged boxcar wood, and roof covered in GP medium canvas, stretched tight over a frame of pine beams. Inside, 2 rows of double-stacked bunks, built from planks pulled from bombed-out rail yards, each bunk fitted with rope webbing salvaged from cargo nets. Capacity: 48 men. Hartman and his 10-man engineer crew had worked straight through 2 nights. The prisoners helped under guard, hauling lumber, holding beams, driving nails. Nobody spoke much. The Germans didn't trust it, thought it was some kind of trap or temporary mockery. The Americans didn't want to seem too friendly, didn't want accusations of fraternization. But the structure went up. Solid, functional, ugly but dry. On the morning of the second day, Hartman opened the doors and gestured to the first group of prisoners. 48 men, the sickest from the medical list, filed inside. They moved slowly, cautiously, like stepping into a building that might collapse. Some sat on the lower bunks and just stared. Others lay down immediately, too exhausted to question it. Hartman placed a thermometer on the central beam and checked it 6 hours later. Inside temperature, 12 degrees Celsius. Outside temperature, 0. The canvas and wood had created an insulation layer that trapped body heat and blocked wind. It wasn't warm, but it was survivable. Samuels appeared that evening with an updated medical report. Respiratory symptoms in the sheltered group dropped 40% in 24 hours, just from being dry. Hartman wrote it down, 40% reduction. That was the number Reinhardt needed to hear. But the next morning, when new prisoners rotated in, something strange happened. They refused to lie down. They sat on the bunks, backs straight, arms folded, eyes scanning the walls like waiting for punishment. One young German, maybe 22, in a torn Wehrmacht tunic, spoke in broken English to the guard. "What this is for? It's a bunk. You sleep on it." "Why?" The guard didn't have an answer. He just shrugged and walked away. Hartman watched through the window. The prisoners sat upright for 3 hours before exhaustion finally overtook suspicion. One by one, they leaned back, closed their eyes, and slept. But even then, some kept their boots on, ready to run. That night, Hartman wrote in his log, "Distrust is structural. They sleep sitting up. They don't believe kindness exists without a bill." He paused, pen hovering, then added, "Neither would I." The report went up the chain within a week. Reinhardt read the numbers, consulted with Samuels, and authorized Phase 2, expansion to shelter 4,000 prisoners. The condition: use only non-priority materials, meaning salvage and scrap. Hartman didn't hesitate. He organized mixed crews, American engineers and German prisoners, and sent them into Bad Kreuznach to dismantle bombed-out warehouses. They pulled doors, beams, roof tiles, window frames, anything that could be repurposed. The work was hard and slow. Nails had to be straightened. Boards had to be planed. Every piece of material was inspected twice. The rhythm became routine. One shelter every 36 hours. Hartman maintained strict separation rules to avoid fraternization accusations. No shared meals, no conversations beyond work instructions, no contact outside the construction site. But even under those constraints, something shifted. Guards reported that prisoners started singing while they worked. Not German marching songs, just simple tunes, folk melodies. They cleaned tools before returning them. They measured twice before cutting. Small gestures, but deliberate. One evening, Hartman walked through the completed structures. and found a prisoner named Fischer, a former carpenter from Munich, carving notches into a beam. Fischer saw him and froze, expecting discipline. "What are you doing?" Hartman asked. Fischer hesitated. "Marking, so I remember." "Remember what?" "That I built something, after burning everything." Hartman didn't respond. He just nodded and kept walking. But the words stayed with him. For 3 years, these men had been soldiers in an army that destroyed cities. Now they were building shelters, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And yet, somewhere in the repetition of sawing and hammering, a strange kind of redemption was happening. Not forgiveness, not absolution, just the slow, grudging reconstruction of dignity through manual labor. By mid-June, the camp had capacity for 4,000 men. Shelters lined the perimeter in neat rows. Each one identical, each one numbered. The mortality rate dropped from 3% to 0.5%. The medical station had empty beds for the first time in weeks. And when the Red Cross inspection team arrived on June 28th, they toured the facilities and noted significant improvements in habitability and health outcomes. That phrase, significant improvements, landed on Reinhardt's desk like a commendation. He called Hartman in and didn't quite smile, but came close. "The Red Cross report mentions you by name, Lieutenant. Says your shelter program is a model for transitional POW facilities." "Just followed orders, sir. Built what was needed with what we had." Reinhardt nodded. "That's what I told them. Standard engineer efficiency, nothing more." They both knew it was more, but neither said it. The praise didn't last. Within a week, Theater Command sent a memo. POW treatment standards must not exceed minimum requirements established by policy. Shelter construction at Rheinlager C must be justified by operational necessity, not humanitarian preference. Translation: someone higher up was nervous that the camp looked too comfortable, that it set a precedent, that other camps would demand the same, and headquarters didn't want to spend resources on former enemies when they could be saved for occupation forces. Colonel Turner, head of Engineer Group B, summoned Hartman to headquarters in Frankfurt. The office was in a requisitioned bank building, all marble floors and empty vaults. Turner sat behind a desk that had probably held Nazi gold 3 months earlier and read through Hartman's construction logs with an accountant's precision. "Explain to me, Lieutenant, how you justified using material classified as non-priority without formal authorization." Hartman kept his voice steady. "The material was salvage from bomb structures, sir. Disused. Reusing it reduced disposal costs by 60% and eliminated sanitation risks from decaying debris." Turner raised an eyebrow. "Sanitation risks?" "Yes, sir. Standing rubble becomes a breeding ground for disease vectors. By clearing it and repurposing structural elements, we achieved dual objectives: waste management and shelter construction. It was bureaucratic jujitsu, turning a humanitarian project into a cost-saving sanitation operation." Turner studied him for a long moment, then closed the file. "You're saying this was a cleanup operation that happened to produce shelters?" "Yes, sir. And if I audit your material logs, I'll find proper waste disposal documentation?" "Every board, sir. Logged, measured, and accounted for." Turner almost smiled. "You're clever, Hartman. Maybe too clever, but the math works. I'm classifying this project as debris clearance with secondary construction utility. That keeps it off the Red Cross radar and gives headquarters an answer if anyone asks why we're building beds for Germans." Hartman nodded. "Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just don't make me regret this. And Hartman, next time you want to save the world, put it in a memo first." By July, Rheinlager C had become a technical reference. British inspectors from the 21st Army Group toured the facilities and copied the designs. They built similar structures at camps in Remagen and Koblenz, calling them Hartmann shelters in internal communications. The American Quartermaster Corps requested blueprints and construction timelines. Hartmann's improvised manual, hand-drawn on brown paper with step-by-step cutting and assembly instructions, circulated through teletypes as temporary shelter, Hartmann pattern. What had started as a moral calculation became engineering doctrine. The cost per shelter, 0.45 man-days. The mortality reduction, 85% in sheltered populations versus unsheltered. The material efficiency, 90% salvaged content. The numbers justified themselves. But the human story ran parallel. Prisoners who had slept sitting up now arranged their bunks with folded blankets and straw pillows. They carved names into the wooden supports, small acts of permanence. Guards reported the first quiet nights in weeks. No groaning, no fighting over space. One sergeant noted in his log, "They don't believe it's over, but they're starting to act like it might be." Among the prisoners was Karl Reuter, former corporal in the Wehrmacht, who'd fought in the Ardennes and surrendered near Bastogne. In a Red Cross interview later that summer, he described the collective shock. "We thought it was an experiment. Sleeping dry felt indecent, like we didn't deserve it. Some men refused for days, but eventually the cold wins. You lie down, you sleep, and then you realize the war really ended." That quote ended up in a 1946 report on psychological rehabilitation of POWs, symbolizing the strange transition from combat to captivity to uncertain peace. The community subplot emerged when Hartmann requisitioned local German carpenters to accelerate construction. He needed speed, and the nearby village had skilled labor sitting idle. Turner approved it as civilian labor exchange for rations, a bureaucratic workaround that let Hartmann employ former enemies under supervision. The contact was minimal. Germans worked on construction details. Americans supervised. No meals together. No conversations beyond measurements and instructions. But the work itself became a bridge. Women from the village began repairing prisoner uniforms in exchange for flour. A blacksmith fixed tools for American engineers in trade for coal. Small transactions, tightly controlled, but each one a stitch pulling together a torn social fabric. The camp became an accidental hub of post-war reconciliation, not through speeches or policy, but through the simple economics of mutual need. People who'd been shooting at each other 3 months earlier now hammered nails side by side. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was something more fragile and more practical. Coexistence through construction. Hartmann didn't see himself as a diplomat. He just needed carpenters, and they needed food. But Turner recognized the strategic value. In a memo to Theater Command, he noted that controlled civilian integration at POW facilities reduces local resentment and accelerates normalization of occupation zones. The language was cold, but the effect was real. Towns that cooperated with American engineers got preferential treatment for reconstruction materials. Towns that didn't waited. By late August, the pattern was spreading. Other camps began employing local labor. Other commanders started seeing POWs not as permanent enemies, but as temporary logistical problems that could be managed with efficiency and minimal cruelty. It was a small shift, invisible in newspapers, but significant in practice. The war was over. The question now was what kind of peace would follow. On August 28, 1945, Hartmann received transfer orders to Nuremberg. He was needed for war crimes trial preparations. building courtroom facilities and housing for judges. Rheinlager C would be dissolved, its prisoners gradually released and repatriated as processing centers caught up with the backlog of surrendered Wehrmacht personnel. Hartmann spent his last day at the camp doing inventory. 7,000 registered prisoners over 4 months. 19 deaths total, mostly from pre-existing conditions. Mortality rate, 0.27%. The lowest of any comparable facility in the European theater. The Red Cross had cited it in their annual report. The Quartermaster Corps had adopted his construction manual. Engineer training schools at Fort Belvoir were using his diagrams to teach rapid field shelter assembly. But none of that made it into Hartmann's final long entry. He just wrote, "Salvaged wood, condition satisfactory. All material accounted for. Recommend structures be maintained for interim use pending facility closure." The report disappeared into a filing cabinet in Frankfurt, one of thousands of after-action documents from the European campaign. Nobody framed it. Nobody made a speech. Hartmann packed his duffel bag, shook hands with Captain Davies, and climbed into a jeep heading south. He didn't know that years later, during the Korean War, Army engineers would use the Hartmann pattern as a standard template for temporary refugee shelters. He didn't know that his improvised plywood and canvas design would house displaced civilians across Asia and later in Vietnam. He didn't know that a generation of military engineers would study his work not as a humanitarian gesture, but as a case study in resource efficiency under constraint. All he knew was that fewer men had died than should have, and that he'd built something that worked. Before leaving, he walked through the camp one last time. Prisoners were already packing, preparing for transport to repatriation centers. Some had left small items on the bunks: folded blankets, carved wooden figurines, scraps of paper with messages in German and broken English. One note read simply, "Danke, we slept warm." Hartmann picked it up, folded it carefully, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he walked to the jeep and didn't look back. The legacy unfolded slowly. In 1946, the Army Corps of Engineers published Field Manual 5N148, Expedient Shelter Construction, which included detailed diagrams of raised platform designs using salvaged materials. The introduction credited innovations developed during POW facility management in 1945, but didn't mention Hartmann by name. Doctrine wasn't about individuals. It was about reproducible systems. But among engineers who'd served in Germany, the name stuck. Hartmann shelters became shorthand for quick-build structures that prioritized function over aesthetics, that used 90% salvaged materials, that could be erected by semi-skilled labor in under 2 days. When the Korean War flooded South Korea with refugees in 1950, American engineers built thousands of them. When typhoons hit Japan in 1951, they built them there too. The design evolved, got refined, lost Hartmann's name in official documents, but the core principle remained. Keep people off the ground. Keep them dry. Use what you have. In 1952, a young captain named Morrison wrote to Hartmann, by then a civilian engineer in Cleveland, asking about the original POW camp shelters. Morrison was writing a thesis on rapid deployment construction and had found references to temporary structures, Rheinlager C, Germany, 1945. Hartmann wrote back on a single page, used salvaged boxcar lumber and canvas, 36-hour build time, nothing complicated, just kept men out of the mud. Morrison wanted more. Hartmann didn't give it. He wasn't interested in being studied. He'd done a job. The job was over. But in 1968, a German journalist tracked him down, doing research on post-war POW camps. The journalist had interviewed Karl Reuter, the former Wehrmacht corporal who told a story about sleeping on wooden bunks and thinking the war had finally ended. Reuters said, "We didn't believe it when they surrendered. We believed it when someone decided we shouldn't sleep in mud anymore." The journalist asked Hartman if he remembered that decision. Hartman was 63 by then, retired, living in a modest house with his wife and a small workshop where he built furniture for grandchildren. He thought about the question for a long time. "I remember the math," he said finally. "Pneumonia cases were exponential. Building costs were linear. The intersection point was obvious." "So it was just calculation?" Hartman smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Everything's calculation. You just choose which variables matter. I chose fewer dead men. Some people choose policy compliance. Both are math. Just different equations." The journalist published the interview in a German magazine. It got translated and reprinted in an American military journal. Quietly, without ceremony, Hartman's name entered the historical record. Not as a hero, not as a rebel, just as an engineer who'd looked at a problem and solved it. The real epilogue happened in places Hartman never saw. In Korean villages where American engineers built shelters that looked suspiciously like old German POW bunks. In Vietnam, where Marine construction battalions erected Hartman-style platforms for refugee camps. In every disaster zone where military engineers arrived and needed to house thousands of people with minimal resources and maximum speed. The design lived because it worked. Because it was simple enough for non-experts to replicate. Because it used whatever materials were available. Because it put human survival ahead of regulations that said minimum standard and defined minimum as barely breathing. Karl Reuter died in 1983 in Munich. His obituary mentioned his service in the Wehrmacht and his post-war career as a schoolteacher. It didn't mention Rheinlager See, but his family found a small wooden figurine among his belongings, carved from pine, with a date scratched on the bottom, June 1945. His daughter asked what it was. His wife said he'd made it in a POW camp during the first night he slept dry in months. He'd carried it for 38 years. Hartman died in 1991 in Cleveland. His obituary mentioned his engineering career, his service in World War II, his 40-year marriage. It listed his children and grandchildren. It said he'd been a quiet man who built things that lasted. There was no mention of Rheinlager See. His family didn't know the story. He'd never told them. But somewhere in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, in the Army Engineer School's library, sits a faded brown manual with hand-drawn diagrams titled Temporary Shelter Hartman Pattern. Students still study it, not as history, just as technique. The most enduring legacy is the one that disappears into utility. The solution so obvious, it stops needing a name. Between the mud and the mathematics, between the orders and the outcome, Edward Hartman made a choice that thousands of people lived because of. He didn't break the rules. He bent them until they fit around human need. He proved that sometimes the hardest engineering problem isn't structural. It's deciding that men shouldn't drown in bureaucracy while sitting in the rain. The camp at Rheinlager See existed for 4 months in 1945. It's gone now, plowed under, turned into farmland, erased by time and reconstruction. But the echo remains. In every military manual that says rapid shelter assembly, in every disaster response that prioritizes speed over permanence, in every engineer who looks at suffering and calculates that building something is cheaper than burying someone. Hartman's equation was simple. Wood plus labor minus regulation equals life. The answer wasn't loud. It was just there, on raised wooden platforms, under canvas stretched tight against the rain. in the space between revenge and reconstruction, where exhausted men finally stopped sleeping in the mud. And it started because one engineer looked at the mathematics of misery and decided the numbers were unacceptable.